Marvel Snap's newest season, Avengers vs. X-Men, just started, so let's take a look at the best Spotlight caches to open in March. The first Spotlight cache of the month is highlighted by Pixie. Pixie is a 2/1 with an on-reveal ability that shuffles the costs of the cards in your deck. This means that the upside of Pixie is you draw a 6-drop, but it only costs 1 or even 0 if you're playing Wasp and Yellow Jacket. In addition, Pixie has some notable synergy with cards like Mobius M, Mobius, which should remove all the downside from that potential cost shuffling. With your Mobius on the board, you should be able to play a card and then have that card be whatever it is normally, right? You draw your Yondu that got switched with your Magneto. Okay, the Yondu may look like it costs 6, Mobius on the board, that Yondu costs 1 again. The Magneto, on the other hand, will still cost 1 because Mobius only affects the negative part of what Pixie does. However, if your opponent plays a Mobius, this card becomes instantly terrible. If both of you have Mobius, well, all the cards cost what they were going to cost anyway. And that is a major consideration for this deck. Pixie reminds me a lot of Mr. Negative. And I think it is notable that this was a card that was data mined without that text referring to cards starting in your deck. The specific cards that are prevented from being affected by Pixie with that cards starting in your deck text are, of course, Thanos Stones, Thor Hammers, and other cards of that nature. And that means that a lot of the things that you would normally want to do with Pixie, Thanos Stones specifically, are not actually things that work with her. This sort of leaves her in a no man's land. I'm not sure what this card actually wants to be doing. It kind of maybe wants to go in a typical Lockjaw strategy, except they just nerfed the actual card Lockjaw. One place where the actual card Lockjaw hasn't been overly nerfed, however, is if you could play Lockjaw and a 0-cost card such as Wasp on the same turn, and you could probably talk me into some sort of Lockjaw type deck. 12 cards, Wasp, Yellow Jacket, Jane Foster. It doesn't work with the Thors, but drawing those 0 costs is cool anyway. And yes, what should happen if you play Pixie and you play Jane Foster is that you will draw 0-cost cards that are not Wasp and Yellow Jacket, but rather whatever Wasp and Yellow Jacket got shuffled to. At the very least, that is a deck with a clear snap condition and some very powerful things that it can do. The issue, I think, is going to be one of consistency. Good decks in Marvel Snap are not only determined by how good they are when they work, but how good they are when they don't. And I think this is the difference between something like, you say, Wong and something like, say, Loki, right? Like, this is the kind of thing that allows a solid mid-range deck to rise to the top of a lot of different metas because even when they're not working perfectly, they're still working. Whereas with a combo deck like Pixie, or perhaps Mr. Negative as an example, when it's not working, it's really not doing a lot. And I think that's my main worry for Pixie. Me personally, I'm not overly excited for her, but this is the kind of card that when the community gets its hands on, will do so much more in terms of just really stress testing than any human being can do in their head. So right now, my instinct with Pixie is I don't think she'll be very good. But if she is good, I would expect her to be really, really oppressive if she is. So I'm hoping they tested this properly. It's clear they accounted for some of the obvious homes for her with that text preventing her from being used in Thanos. But mostly, this is a card that is either going to be extremely strong or extremely not strong. My advice for you would be to wait a couple days before considering opening to try and figure out which one of those things it actually is. In caches alongside Pixie is Spider-Ham. Spider-Ham is generally a very solid 1-drop disruption card, easily competitive with, if not better than, Iceman, in my opinion, personally. In most situations, Spider-Ham is also a little bit more generally applicable, right? Like, most decks, I feel like, if they're picking 1-drop, would take Spider-Ham over Iceman. And being willing to do that, I think, is kind of important. It does give it, like, some fringe benefits outside of just being a bounce card. However, This is mostly a bounce card, and it is sort of metagame dependent. We've just been in a lot of metagames where Spider-Ham's effect is sort of actively good, where Iceman's effect is sort of generally mitigated by the amount of either energy cheat or lockjaw or hella stuff going on, so it sort of doesn't matter all that much, whereas this card can actually seriously disrupt some of those strategies. That said, I really don't know if he's a hard target for a lot of people, because again, we're talking about him being compared to Iceman, a card you get for free. A lot of decks are not going to see a massive downgrade from Spider-Ham to Iceman, and that means that generally he's not overly a card you should be targeting. Replaceable cards are not the ones you need to be opening caches for. You need to be opening caches for the ones that you cannot replace in any way. For this reason, I think Spider-Ham is not a big draw towards opening this cache. It was a fairly clever move by Second Dinner to include Mobius M Mobius in the caches alongside Pixie. This means, A, that people who open for Pixie will have an obvious synergy card to go alongside her, but B, people who want to beat Pixie will also have a readily available option. Mobius against Pixie strikes me as a little bit better than Mobius with Pixie. It's a lot easier for me to envision myself being the person playing the card that says your deck doesn't do anything than it is for me to envision myself being the person playing a 2-1 and then a 3-3 and then saying the rest of my deck is going to make up for this somehow ? Because I personally believe that the uptick in Mobius that Pixie will likely cause her to be one of those cards that sort of beats herself. And there's a lot of precedence for this kind of deck coming onto the game and then just being immediately hated out because everyone knows that a lot of people are playing it. Like I said, I'm interested to see what Pixie does, but I do expect a significant uptick in Mobius, not just because it's in this cache, but also because if you're a Pixie deck, you're probably playing it. And if you're trying to beat a Pixie deck, you're probably playing it. So if there's a good week to get Mobius, this is one. And Mobius is one of the better Series 4 cards in the entire game. He's a relatively constant piece of the metagame, a tech card that, to my mind, has really supplanted Cosmo, for example, as a inclusion in a lot of these sort of mid-range Loki decks. This is a card that is quite good and quite relevant to top-level play, a very, very solid card, despite the fact that playing a 3-3 is mopey. I honestly think that it was the inclusion of Mobius in Sarah that drove Sarah to become competitive for probably the first real time in a long time recently, for that brief moment that it was before the rise of Hela, because Mobius plus the power that the Sarah deck had gave it a positive Loki matchup, and that kind of stuff is really valuable. Moreover, if you're someone who hates Loki but likes playing the types of decks Loki beats, these sort of good cards mid-range decks, I would say that Mobius is an absolutely required pickup, because without this card, you have absolutely no shot at beating it. In fact, I think that Mobius is probably the most appealing card in this entire cache to me because of how worried I am about the meta turning into good cards mid-range stuff, which Loki handily beats. Having this card in your back pocket is going to be beneficial to you at some point is my best guess. Yes, you may be able to play, I don't know, Phoenix Force if you want to beat the degenerate mid-range stuff, sure. But if you want to play mid-range decks and Loki is in the meta, you probably are going to need a Mobius if that's something you want to do. I consider him fairly valuable, but again, this is actually a fairly low value cache, right? This is a Series 4 card. You are likely to be better off picking up Mobius with tokens and then using your caches on a different week. That said, he is the probably best card in this cache. Then Mockingbird enters the caches, and Mockingbird is a 5/9 that costs 1 less for each card on the battlefield under your control that did not start in your deck. This can mean most obviously Thanos stones, but it's, cards created from Maria Hill, cards created from Agent 13, Snowguard, Agent Coulson. And I think a lot of people look at this and say, oh boy, Thanos and Loki got good stuff. But I actually think Mockingbird is quite an interesting card because a lot of what has been keeping Thanos relevant recently, and a lot of people's heuristics for judging Thanos, I think, may not line up with the reality of the situation. Loki was a Thanos counter back in about December, when all the Thanos decks were playing things like Professor X, things like Goliath, things like Blue Marvel, Jeff. They were that kind of deck, right? That's the Thanos deck that Loki really beat. As Thanos evolved into this Cull Obsidian, blob, lockjaw monstrosity, the Loki matchup sort of consequently got better and better. As the Loki matchup got better, a lot of the reason for that was revealed to be the sort of asymmetry of cards like Lockjaw and even potentially Cull and, of course, Blob, allowing the Thanos player to have better cards than what the Loki player got from them. My worry with Mockingbird is that it's the kind of card that, yes, the Thanos deck's going to want to play this, absolutely, but without maybe Lockjaw in the deck. As a Loki player, you end up seeing the Thanos deck move back towards Professor X, Alioth, and Mockingbird stuff, right? And if you're a Loki player, you are overjoyed, because that is the exact kind of deck that cannot beat the card Loki at any point in the game, unless they're also playing maybe a Mobius. Remember last cache. Mockingbird also kind of getting a little bit hosed by Mobius makes her like a little bit more of a risky proposition than I think people think. It's like, okay, yeah, Thanos may be getting like a very cheap 9-power dude, but it's also by building to make that cheap 9-power dude better, not finicky enough to avoid dying to Loki. One of the things that we've learned over the past few weeks and months is that the kind of decks that can succeed into Loki are the kind of decks that need sort of specific setup early and aren't just these like decks full of haymakers and powerful on-rate cards. And the more Thanos becomes a deck full of haymakers and powerful on-rate cards, the more it becomes a deck that Loki wants to actually queue into and then just play the card Loki into and then play all those powerful haymakers and on-rate cards for either 1 or 2 cheaper, thanks to the Quinjet. Now, Mockingbird obviously having even more synergy with this is kind of a tough sell to me, honestly. I view this card as very strong, but her effect on an archetype like Thanos might well be to make it more vulnerable to the counterplay that exists to it, which for the last few months has been Loki, and it has been relatively invulnerable too. Now, perhaps this kind of change in the Thanos structure was inevitable with the nerfs to Lockjaw, but I do think that Mockingbird will likely accelerate it. She's an exciting card for me, but I do have some consideration for like, yes, I think she's very strong, but I'm not overly worried about her being like, oh God, it's Mockingbird, I'm dead. It's more like, this is a card that is doing something that is traditionally powerful, but countered by various strategies that already exist. And I think when Thanos wants to be like a small mid-range deck, the interesting thing about that is it's almost never really worked. Thanos has only ever been a Professor X Alioth deck or a Lockjaw deck. And while this is a buff to the Professor X Alioth type of deck, there are some other cards in this month that are pretty big nerfs to that kind of thing. So I'm interested to see what it does to Thanos, what those cards coming out may impact the utility of Professor X specifically, and of course, whether or not Thanos goes back to being absolutely hard farmed by the card Loki and what that could mean. As far as other things to do with Mockingbird, I think the other thing that really sticks out to me about this card is Squirrel Girl and Shauna are both going to make her significantly cheaper, and a deck like Zoo is actually going to be more able to probably make Mockingbird cheap than like Thanos with a bad draw. I don't know exactly if we're going to be like hybridizing Squirrel Girl Shauna into Thanos. That seems a little bit much to me, but maybe just a Squirrel Girl can go in there. I'm not exactly sure. Squirrel Girl reducing this by 2, Shauna reducing this by 3. Like, it's not nothing, and I do consider this like a potential Zoo card. A lot of my thought process around Zoo is like, okay, so like our top end looks like, Shang-Chi, Cull Obsidian, Khazar, Blue Marvel, and this. Then there's a Shauna, and then there's a Kyera, and then there's like 5 1-drops. Is that, or 4 1-drops and a Zabu? Is that a good deck? Like, I've done the Zoo Copium meter joke a couple times, but it's like, that actually does sort of seem like it could be bounce-ish power levels to me. I don't hate it instinctively. It seems like kind of compelling to me, and I'm kind of interested to see where it goes. I'll probably end up trying it. Like, it's not all that far off from being something that's legitimately powerful, just as a deck that is executing a strategy with some big bodies, some tech, the ability to go wide. I'm kind of compelled by it, I'm not gonna lie. First up alongside Mockingbird and the caches is Miss Marvel. Miss Marvel is an excellent 4-drop threat. I see people say, oh, I don't have Miss Marvel. Can I replace her with Omega Red? And the answer is almost always no, you cannot do that. Miss Marvel is a 414. Omega Red is significantly smaller than that. And I think more particularly to Miss Marvel, her ability to spread power across lanes is key in decks like Lockdown or Loki just as a normal threat, or in Living Tribunal, where you are multiplying her with Onslaught and perhaps Mystique. This is the key card across multiple archetypes, perhaps the most appealing card in any cache this month, a very solid pickup, a classic mid-range banger, one of the strongest cards in Marvel Snap and has been since release, only receiving a minor nerf. That said, that minor nerf was actually important. You will lose games. When you don't have 2 units, you will lose her ability some of the time. It does matter. She's a more fair card now. You do have to do more work for her, but fundamentally she is quite powerful. Usually, I would say this is a card worth picking up. Being paired with Mockingbird, a card I already find interesting, makes this cache quite compelling to me personally. Man-Thing does not move the needle for me. This is a 4/5 with a strong ability to invalidate early game plays from your opponent, but it has generally done very little in terms of the actual competitive metagame. This is not a card that people play a lot, and the recent reversion to Luke Cage, while it does give you the ability to protect your own stuff from Man-Thing, does mean that there's sort of an inherent obvious counter should any Man-Thing deck become popular enough to demand it. One of the main things that's preventing Man-Thing from being popular enough to demand hard counters in various decks is that it's just not good enough to do that. So as a 4-cost card, this card has immense competition. A lot of decks that would be playing Man-Thing are just like, well, why don't I just play a Cull Obsidian now? That's a 4/10. This is only a 4/11 if I hit 3 things, and sometimes it hits my stuff too. And it's hard to argue with that. One area where Man-Thing does have unique utility is in mid-range high evolutionary decks that are looking to leverage the ability to apply negative power to your opponents in order to make Abomination cheaper. However, in those lists, playing Man-Thing on 4 often involves, spending 4 energy. So you aren't getting any buffs from your Misty Knight, you aren't getting any debuffs from your Cyclops, and so he ends up in a little bit of an odd spot. His cost in those situations, despite being one of the best costs in the game, makes him a little bit prohibitively difficult to play. For this reason, I would say Man-Thing is not a draw. I would not open this cache looking for Man-Thing. If you do open this cache, the draws are going to be Miss Marvel and Mockingbird. Next up is Cannonball, a 5/8 who was changed so late in the datamine process that I had to make this myself. He is a card that will always move as an on-reveal ability, the highest power card away from the location that you play him on, and if that card cannot move, it is destroyed and replaced with a rock. Now, a lot of people look at this as, oh my god, I'm going to counter the blob. And while that is true that it will work, it does require like a sort of specific set of circumstances that are not particularly likely to happen. For example, you need to not have priority, and also you need to know which lane the blob is going to be. It seems a little bit difficult to me. What I look at this card and see is sort of fixed arrow. This card is to Arrow as Alioth was to Old Leader. Old Leader was a priority deck win con that was explicitly attempting to do something very specific and say, when I am ahead, I'm going to win the game. And Alioth is a sort of quote-unquote fixed version of that, a priority deck win con that says, when I am ahead, I'm going to win the game. In the same sort of note, this is fixed Arrow. Arrow was a sort of soft leader, and this is like a way to make the effect and feel of a card like Arrow be replicated without replicating the extremely dangerous, overpowered nature of it. What that means is Cannonball is going to win one lane. Old Arrow won every lane by pulling everything played on turn 5, on turn 6 over to where she was. Cannonball is going to win one lane, and that is a compelling thing to do. However, the interesting thing about this card is you look at it and it's a 5/8 stat line. Okay, that's great. 5/8 win a lane is actually not that far above rate. Like, for example, we have, I don't know, Devil Dinosaur. That's usually a 5-cost win a lane. Like, this is not an unprecedented card. And Devil Dinosaur wins a lane by winning it, not by sending the card somewhere else where it can win another lane. Like, I think this card feels and looks like it would be strong, but when I think about it more, It's like, okay, one of the basic principles of Marvel Snap is that when you play something big and win a lane with that big thing, what you have done is effectively invalidate your opponent's investment in the lane. This is why Blob was so good. You'd invest in a lane, Blob would come down, all your investment effectively gets invalidated. When I think of what value trading is in Marvel Snap, that's the stuff I think about. You play a big guy, I invalidate it with either a bigger guy or getting rid of it, and I come out ahead on that exchange. The interesting thing about Cannonball is, yes, you play him and he will win a lane. That's cool. But I find it hard to create a bunch of situations where he's not also losing you a lane. Like, it's kind of interesting. I think this card is compelling, and I think as a priority win con, he makes a lot of sense, but I'm not exactly sure he ends up passing the mustard, or cutting the mustard, I should say, as a, cutting the mustard. What a weird phrase. I'm sure I'm just messing it up, or it's like from some old English thing. But my point is, I don't think he actually like passes the test as a competitive card. That's my instinct on it right now. I think this card is fine and solid, but I think most of the value you're going to get out of him is as a surprise option, which means, of course, this is a card that's going to go absolutely nuts on Twitter. Someone's going to put like Cannonball in a good cards deck and be like, yo, no other card would have won me the game here. And it's like, a lot of the time a bigger card would have won you the game too. But as a 5/8 with a potentially seriously beneficial ability, like, this is a card that is good on rate. And I think allowing cards like this to just be played in good cards decks, like this is a Legion. Every 5-drop is either a Legion or a Devil Dino. This is a 5/8 with some upside text. It's a Legion. And what you decide to do with that is up to you. Right now, my instinct is this is an interesting card to me, but I don't expect it to really move the needle overwhelmingly. I just expect it to be like, okay, one of many solid 5-drop options that you have. Alongside Cannonball in caches is Kitty Pryde, who has been absolutely terrible for an extended period of time now, since the nerfs to Angela and Elsa Bloodstone really took her out of commission. That said, Kitty Pryde has a chance at being potentially relevant thanks to the existence of Hope Summers, although I personally think it's likely that if Kitty Pryde is the best thing to do with Hope Summers, that means we're probably not using Hope Summers correctly, but it is something to consider. Kitty Pryde has been not worth purchasing for an extended period of time, however, and I think that remains true today. Barring any unforeseen changes, like with Hope Summers, I do not expect Kitty Pryde to be something that is worth opening for. If by the time this cache comes around, it turns out Hope Summers is like actually making this card incredible and I was wrong, then it is totally worth just throwing this section out. Just don't even listen to it, don't even look at it, just skip right past it, don't worry about it, and evaluate Kitty Pryde in that new context. One of the reasons I do these videos is because I think it's important to convey to you that you need to evaluate all these decisions in context. My general basic advice for all of these is like wait 3 days and see how it looks. Like for every single one of these caches, I would recommend just wait 3 days, see how it looks. But that doesn't really, that doesn't really play well on YouTube. It is my advice though. So sorry, YouTube, I guess. The other card in the caches with Cannonball is Ghost Spider, and I don't really know what they were cooking with this one. I guess she just needed to get back in a cache or something, because this is not a card worth opening for. Ghost Spider is most commonly played in Phoenix Force, so if you want to be a Phoenix Force gamer, and I will admit, it is currently having a mild resurgence at High Infinite. We'll see how far that goes. That said, if you want to be a Phoenix Force gamer, this is a required card. It's just, do you really want to be a Phoenix Force gamer? That's a real question here. And I think the nerf to Hela did sort of put into question what hard to interact with combo deck will rise to the top of the meta. Phoenix Force could be that deck. I don't want to sit here and be like, oh, Phoenix Force has always been bad, so it will continue to be bad. There are genuine meta forces that are pushing Phoenix Force in the right direction. The nerf of Lockjaw made Hela significantly worse. It's a hard to interact with combo deck. Generally, being a hard to interact with combo deck is a good thing. The addition of Shuri Nimrod into the shell has been quite solid. The addition of Eliath into the shell has been quite solid. A hard to interact with combo deck is a good thing to be. In addition, Ghost Spider doesn't just have synergy with the Phoenix Force part of the plan in this deck, it also has synergy with the Nimrod part of the plan, as many people like to drop Eliaths in the Nimrod lane. And you can still Carnage Venom while moving the Ghost Spider out of danger here. You use the Ghost Spider to move your Nimrod, you don't get Eliath, you don't get Cosmode anymore. That is a dangerous card to have access to. If you are a Phoenix Force gamer, that is the situation in which you want to pick this up. If Phoenix Force is dominating the meta, if it's a great deck, that is the potential future in which Ghost Spider is a draw. In almost every other future, she is not a draw. The final cache features War Machine, a 4/6 with an on-reveal ability that effectively turns every card in your hand into Jeff. However, this ability also removes play restrictions from cards in your hand. For example, if your opponent has played a Sandman, that won't matter anymore. If your opponent has played a Professor X, that won't matter anymore. And if you have an Infinite, an Ebony Maw, or a Cull Obsidian in your hand, you will be able to play them. My natural inclination for this card is it probably goes in something like Black Knight, a deck that was already playing the Infinite and was already playing Cull Obsidian a decent amount of the time. Having Zabu as an option is also absolutely great. I think generally people look at this and they look at, okay, this is a card that's going to cheat out the Infinite, it's going to cheat out Ebony Maw. And yes, it'll do that. Sure, it'll do that. But pure downside, this thing I think is comparable to Iron Lad, right? This is a 4/6 with the ability to potentially win you the game sometimes. I think it's reasonable to consider it, 4-drop Legion type card, where this is like just a very good card, generally, that has synergy with what you're trying to do, generally, and also just kind of randomly, you win a game where there's a Sanctum Sanctorum, right? Like, you don't have to always be doing Infinite War Machine stuff. You're good if you are, probably, but just randomly winning Sanctum Sanctorum is pretty cool, right? Like, things of that nature, in addition to being a sort of pillar of how the deck plays out, that's a really interesting thing to do. In addition, when War Machine comes out, I expect a precipitous downturn in Professor X play, and that makes me really curious about what Thanos is going to do. Because as discussed in the Mockingbird section, Thanos wants to be usually either a Professor X deck or it wants to be a Lockjaw deck. Lockjaw just got nerfed. People are going back to Professor X. And yes, that has the downside of likely losing to Loki. But now it has the even more significant downside of the newest card that just came out is going to absolutely ruin the thing you're investing in. You spent 5 energy on that Professor X. 5 whole energy. And it's about to be completely invalidated by a 4/6 that, if we're being really honest, is probably a 3/6. I have fairly high hopes for War Machine. I think that this is a very powerful card. I think that it'll be worth picking up. It's one of my favorite cards of the season. I'm excited to see what he does. I think he'll be a long-time player. However, I would be remiss if I didn't note this. The Darkhawk notes seemed to indicate that they were very aware that Zabu was a potential issue. I wouldn't be shocked if in, the next, 6 months or something, this guy becomes a worse investment due to a potential Zabu nerf. Like, I personally have been advocating for that for a while. I feel like it is the kind of thing that would make sense for them to do. And I also do think that as a 4/6, like, this is a card that is going to get a lot of a boost from Zabu. And if Zabu were to be nerfed, I mean, you know me, I think it probably just deleted maybe a little bit. But if Zabu were to get nerfed, I am generally of the opinion that this card would get significantly worse. So my only real risk, I think, with War Machine is if the shells that surround it get nerfed. Because right now, it just feels like pretty free to put this card in like a Black Knight deck and be like, all right, my Cull Obsidian comes down for free. This is a 3/6. I can play the Infinite. Maybe I even do some Hope Summer stuff. Play like Infinite Ebony Maw. I don't really know. But I'm doing strong stuff, and I'm not really paying a cost for it because I have Zabu and this guy. And that kind of stuff just seems sort of like a free include. And if that context changes, it's possible he gets much worse. It's also possible he's like more generally applicable than that, right? Like, it's possible that you just play Black Knight, or not Black Knight. It's possible you just play War Machine in a vast variety of decks. Like, that is also entirely possible. I'm interested to see what happens. I'm curious to see what happens, but right now, preliminarily, this is probably the card I'm the most excited about from this season. Next up is Silver Samurai in the caches with War Machine, and Silver Samurai is, fine. Like, It's a card that is a playable card some of the time. People can play it as a method of hand attack. It has never really made it out of the, I guess I would say, the gutter. It's always been like kind of fringy. There were like a couple weeks where it was really good in Hella because it was the only way you'd ever beat Living Tribunal, but then Living Tribunal really went away and we could stop running this card and run something a little bit more suited to how the other matchups actually play out. And yeah, it's a disruptive card that has never really found a home. A card that I'd honestly consider buffing if it wasn't so annoying to play against, right? Like, this is the kind of card that you don't ever really want to make too strong because it's really annoying if it is. And so you end up in this weird spot with Silver Samurai where I feel like it's hard to buff and it's not particularly good. And that sort of all adds up to I would not really consider opening for it. That doesn't really seem like what I would want to do. Silk is a card that used to be quite good and has since sort of fallen entirely out of contention for being a serious contender. As a 2/5 though, it is more generally applicable than most of the move package that it was played with. Like, this is a card that is still a 2/5. It's not that bad. You can play this card. It's just the move package, the Silky Smooth deck, has been more or less entirely invalidated by Loki. However, I do currently have a little bit of hope for this because, no pun intended, it's a pretty cool Hope Summers card, and a lot of the move stuff seems pretty compelling with Hope, right? Like, you have Silk on Hope, you get more procs. You have Jeff on Hope, you get more procs. You have Nightcrawler on Hope, you get more procs. You just, like, play the Silk move core with Hope Summers in it. And yeah, you probably end up with a terrible Loki matchup. I'm not really sure how to fix that other than just like hard running Mobius, but it's like, this is the kind of thing that does seem fairly compelling to me as a pair with Hope Summers. And so it's possible by the time this card comes around in these spotlight caches, that'll be like 4 weeks, 4 weeks after Hope Summers has been released, we'll actually have a better idea of how much that works. I think without that being a major factor, Silk would not be a draw. There is a possible future where she ends up being quite a compelling card due to that potential synergy. All right, y'all. Thank you for making it through that video. I know it was kind of extra long. I talked a lot about these cards, but they are really exciting. One thing that is not exciting, though, is that while the new cards are excellent, we've had some really amazing weeks to open recently, like the first 2 weeks of last season, the cache with Kyera in it, which was just basically giving you the She-Not deck. Like, there were really good weeks to open last season, and I think this season there are some much weaker weeks. And I think that's, a natural consequence of, we've had some really good ones, and I guess there's all these other cards they've got to get into the caches too. And so that means that, yeah, there's going to be some months where the real draws are going to be the new cards. But I do think that that actually sort of does recontextualize how you need to examine these caches. Because right now, of the cards that are not new in these caches, the main draws are probably Miss Marvel and maybe Mobius, right? Like, these are good cards, but they're not approaching, the Thanos cache last month, the Loki cache last month. Like, those are staples. And so that means that there are some interesting pressures this month. You almost want to be considering using tokens instead, because if you're someone who has spotlight caches to spare, you end up in this spot where it's like, I might be able to get more out of these spotlight caches if there were actually 2 cards that I wanted in them. However, because of what Second Dinner has done to token acquisition, I'd imagine that for most people watching this, that's just not a viable thing to do. And so that means that I really want you watching this to be careful with your tokens, be careful with your caches this month, because there are some pretty mediocre boxes out there. And if you end up opening a couple bad rolls and you don't have 4 caches saved up to get that new card, this is a really bad month to do that. Any month is a bad month to do that, but this month specifically, you can get really screwed over. It could be quite bad. If you open Kitty Pryde Ghost Spider and that's what you spent your spotlight caches on, that's really tough to deal with. So please be careful this month. Use your caches wisely. And as always, I've been KM Best, you've been phenomenal, and I will see you in the next one.